So what if the reason that they froze $130 million wasn't politics, but panic? Because this story doesn't just start with rumors. It doesn't start with headlines or some social media outrage. It actually starts with Tim Walz, the state of Minnesota, and a paper trail that's so explosive that the U.S. Congress didn't just expose it. They followed it. Now, for years, Americans were told that this was exaggerated, that the fraud was isolated, that the warnings were overblown. But then something changed. Money stopped moving. Funds were frozen. Assets started getting seized. And then all of a sudden, federal agencies that never move quietly are all of a sudden moving all at once. Now, this wasn't just a hearing. This wasn't just an oversight. When the House Oversight Committee started pulling the threads, the U.S. Department of Agriculture froze funding. The U.S. Department of Treasury began tracking foreign transfers, and the U.S. Department of Justice stepped in where the state wouldn't. Now, if you're sitting at home wondering why you work, why you pay taxes, follow the rules, meanwhile, billions of dollars disappear into a system that never seems accountable, you're not crazy. You're not alone. And you're about to see exactly why this story did not end with exposure. Because once Congress followed the money, everything started collapsing. Drop a like for the video. Be sure to subscribe and support the movement. All right, folks, this story doesn't begin with a speech or a headline. It actually begins with U.S. Congress and House Oversight Committee asking one quiet question. Where did the money go? Because once Congress stopped listening to press releases and started tracing payments, the entire structure around Tim Walz and Minnesota began to wobble. Now, this wasn't ideological. This wasn't partisan. This was just accounting. Now, at the very center of all of it is the Minnesota Department of Human Services. This is the gatekeeper for massive federal programs. Now, for years, DHS was responsible for oversight, compliance, and enforcement. And under Trump's administration, enforcement posture in January 2026, this is the kind of failure that doesn't just get spun, it gets examined. Now, here's the part most people missed. Congress didn't accuse first. They audited, they subpoenaed, they followed transfers and approvals and ignored warnings. And once the trail lit up, it became very clear that this had crossed the line from political controversy into federal exposure. Because when money moves without accountability, power moves right along with it, and Congress noticed that. So long before this became a national scandal, the warnings were already sitting in black and white. The Office of Legislative Auditor, they flagged repeated irregularities as early as 2011. So by 2013, reports pointed to systemic failures inside of Minnesota's child care and welfare oversight. By 2017, internal alerts were no longer subtle. They were urgent. Now, inside the Minnesota Department of Human Services, compliance staff raised alarms about inflated claims, shell providers, and a complete breakdown of enforcement. Those alerts didn't vanish. They were logged, documented, and escalated. And that timeline that I just shared with you, it matters. Because Tim Walz, he entered the gubernatorial race in 2018 with these issues already publicly documented. Prosecutions were underway, audit reports were circling. The fraud wasn't hidden, it was inconvenient. Whistleblowers who pushed too hard, they were sidelined, reforms stalled, oversight mechanisms stayed frozen in place while payouts continued. No emotion is needed here. The receipts speak for themselves. Now, this wasn't some single missed memo. This was a decade-long paper trail that Minnesota leadership chose not to pull. And that decision would soon leave the state exposed the moment Congress started asking questions. Now, for years, officials inside Minnesota, they operated under a dangerous assumption. This would never leave the state. That audits could be managed, that whistleblowers could be contained, that the press would lose interest, and that Washington would stay hands off. Well, that arrogance is exactly what turned negligence into exposure. Because when you treat federal money like a local political tool, you forget one thing. It's not your money. It belongs to taxpayers across the country. And eventually, someone notices when it stops adding up. Now, under Tim Walz, enforcement stayed weak while payouts continued. Investigations stalled. Oversight committees met and changed nothing. Now, that silence was not accidental. It was protection, political protection built on the belief that the consequences would never rise above Minnesota politics. And this is why this matters, guys. The moment U.S. Congress realized that the fraud wasn't isolated, that it was systemic, documented, and ignored, the rules changed. Now, this stopped being about state embarrassment and it became a federal liability. And once the line was crossed, Minnesota was no longer in control of how this story ended. And this is exactly why people are exhausted, because whether it's government programs or massive bureaucracies or insurance plans, the system always seems to work perfectly for the people that are running it and terribly for the people that are paying into this thing. Every dollar you overpay, it goes somewhere and it's not back to you. And this is especially true with Medicare. A bad Medicare plan doesn't just cost a little more, it quietly drains you month after month while the insurance company wins. And this is why I partner with Chapter. Chapter flips the script by actually optimizing your Medicare coverage, not selling you whatever plan pays them the most, but by actually making sure that you're not overpaying for gaps that you didn't even know were there. Now, most people, they're already calling the phone number right down below for help, or they're visiting askchapter.org/Ron. There's a link down below. You can click on that right now to find out what their plan is really actually costing them. The phone number again is 909-563-8279, because once you understand where your money is really going, you stop letting it disappear. So when the U.S. Department of Agriculture froze roughly $130 million in federal funds, that wasn't a warning shot. That was a judgment call. Federal agencies do not freeze funds lightly. It requires documented failures, repeated noncompliance, and proof that oversight mechanisms have actually broken down. Now, Minnesota didn't just cross one red line. It crossed several red lines. The USDA concluded that safeguards were ineffective, fraud controls were ignored, and corrective actions weren't taken even after years of warnings. And critically, those failures occurred while Tim Walz was in office, overseeing agencies responsible for compliance. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about optics. It was about risk. Now, the federal government determined that continuing to send money would likely result in continued abuse. So they stopped the flow. And here's the key shift here. Once funds are frozen, the assumption becomes guilt until proven otherwise. Now, Minnesota now had to explain itself, not the other way around. That freeze marked the moment that the scandal stopped being theoretical and it started producing consequences. And this is where the story stops being about mismanagement and it starts becoming something much bigger. So once the U.S. Department of Agriculture froze funding, another agency took notice, the U.S. Department of Treasury. And Treasury doesn't get involved because of bad paperwork. Treasury gets involved when money is moving in ways that raise red flags far beyond state borders. Now, under Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, enhanced scrutiny was placed on overseas transfers connected to Minnesota-based entities tied to welfare and child care programs. Why? Because when public funds are being sent abroad, whether it's intentionally or not, the question is not just fraud anymore, it's exposure. Foreign remittances change everything. They trigger anti-money laundering protocols. They pull in federal monitoring systems. And they raise the possibility that taxpayer dollars could be flowing into regions or networks that the federal government is legally required to track. And so this is where it gets worse. Once Treasury starts watching the money, the state loses control of the narrative. The data speaks for itself. And all of a sudden, what Minnesota failed to police locally is now being examined through a national security lens. So here's the hard truth. States can delay, deflect, and even deny, but they cannot run Treasury. The contrast couldn't be clearer. When Minnesota agencies moved slowly for years, federal systems moved fast. Algorithms flagged transactions. Transfer patterns were analyzed. Compliance failures stacked up in real time. Under Donald J. Trump, the enforcement posture in January 2026, it's simple. Fraud isn't negotiated with, it's cut off. The mindset right there, that mindset is exactly why federal agencies didn't wait for political cover. They followed procedure, they followed the law, and they followed the money. Now, once Treasury is involved, explanations don't come through press conferences. They actually come through documentation. And if the documentation doesn't justify the transfers, the consequences escalate quickly. So this is the moment that the illusion collapses. The idea that this could be managed quietly, the belief that it could be framed away. When Treasury watches your accounts, you're no longer arguing intent. You're proving compliance. And Minnesota couldn't do that. This is why everything accelerated, because once the money trail was visible at the federal level, there was no going back. And so once federal agencies started pulling financial records, the story stopped being abstract. It became visible, tangible, impossible to explain away. Investigators weren't just looking at spreadsheets anymore. They were looking at lifestyles. Court filings revealed a fraud figure approaching $250 million, and suddenly the money had a face. Luxury vehicles, high-end real estate, assets that don't appear out of thin air. Judges began ordering forfeitures, Porsches were seized, luxury vehicles, luxury properties were flagged, accounts were frozen, and that matters because asset seizures aren't about suspicion. They're about proof. Courts don't take property unless the government can demonstrate that it was purchased with illicit funds. Now, this is where the fraud narrative collapses. You can argue paperwork errors. You can argue cultural misunderstandings. You cannot argue away luxury assets funded by public money that was meant for children. You can't do it. So here's the new angle that most people miss. Fraud isn't just theft, it's exposure. When assets surface, they connect the beneficiaries to decision makers. They show how long schemes ran and how comfortable participants felt operating in the open. And once those assets were taken, the story stopped being about accusations and then became about consequences. Now, asset forfeiture doesn't just implicate individuals, it implicates oversight. And that's where Tim Walz lost his last layer of protection. Because when judges determine fraud proceeds funded luxury purchases, the next question is unavoidable. How did payments continue after red flags were raised? Those payments flowed through systems overseen by the Minnesota Department of Human Services under Tim Walz's administration. And that is where Keith Ellison enters the picture. Continued payouts, legal resistance to internal enforcement, and political shielding all come under scrutiny once federal agencies stack pressure simultaneously. Now, this is not emotional, it's structural. Asset seizures collapse the plausible deniability claim. They show that the fraud wasn't hidden at the margins. It was financed at scale. So once federal agencies align, USDA freezes, Treasury tracking, judicial forfeiture, the governor's office doesn't get to claim ignorance anymore. The system that he oversaw kept paying long after it should have stopped. And at that point, there's nowhere left to hide. So this is the moment that it becomes clear that the word exposed was never the ending. It was the trigger. First came the hearings, then the audits, then the money froze. After that, the transfers retract. And finally, the assets were seized. Each step followed the last, not because of outrage, but because the evidence forced the next move. That sequence matters. Exposure alone doesn't change systems, consequences do. And once federal agencies started acting in coordination, the pace accelerated in a way Minnesota leadership just couldn't or didn't anticipate. What people are reacting to now isn't just fraud, it's the realization that this went on for years without intervention. That warnings were ignored, that payments continued, and that only after Congress stepped in did the machinery finally start working. So this was not a witch hunt. It was a slow build that snapped into focus all at once. And the reason that this story feels bigger every single day is because it is. Each layer peeled back reveals another failure that just can't be blamed on a single bad actor. Exposed was just the beginning. The fallout is what people are watching right now. So here's where this goes from scandal to precedent. With congressional referrals on the table and federal agencies already involved, the U.S. Department of Justice doesn't need permission to keep digging. Once jurisdiction's established, accountability follows the evidence, wherever it happens to lead. And under Donald J. Trump, the posture in January 2026, it's unmistakable. Federal money comes with federal oversight, and fraud doesn't get a political exception. So why does this matter beyond Minnesota? Because every state that manages federal or at least massive federal programs is watching this unfold. The message is clear. Ignoring red flags doesn't buy more time, or at least not anymore. It multiplies the liability. So this case becomes a template, a warning, a signal that exposure is no longer the end of the road. It's the beginning of enforcement. And for viewers at home that are wondering whether accountability ever shows up for the people at the top, this is what it looks like when it finally does. Drop a like, be sure to subscribe, share this video because we need this truth getting out there. We'll see you next time. Hello.